Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dylan Pilcher. This is a historical project and a retelling of the story of the life of Julius Caesar. I'm doing this almost completely from memory, no script, and the first project of the like that I've done, so please bear with me. When we're talking about Caesar here, we're looking at one of the most influential historical figures of all time. Very, very interesting story with a lot of different elements, very ambiguous. So let's get into it. Caesar was born to a patrician family. This is Aurelia Cotta, this is his mother. He was born in 100 BC. His father went by the same name, Gaius Julius Caesar, that he did. His father was an ally with Marius, and they claimed descendant from gens Julia. They apparently had a crest which certified that they were descended from the gods, so they were descended from Aeneas. So what you're seeing here is a statue of Aeneas. Aeneas was part of the Trojan War story, so if you remember the Trojan war horse, the Greeks versus the Trojans, Aeneas eventually led the survivors to found Rome, as part of the story goes, in the founding of Rome. So Aeneas is a central figure. He's a demigod. He's the son of Venus. And yeah, so obviously some mythical beginnings here. The Romans were a polytheistic people. They worship many gods, and people are aware of this, I think. It's very common that people are into Greek mythology, Roman mythology. Well, there you go. For one of your most influential leaders of all time was claiming to be descended from a god who was Aeneas. So when Caesar was a child, this is a bust of Cornelius Sulla. When Caesar was coming up, he was related to someone named Cinna and someone named Marius. And Cinna and Marius had a long, we'll get into that in a second, but he was an enemy to this guy Sulla. Sulla basically had a bunch of different things happen, long history, long story, but he returned to Rome with an army and essentially put a list of names on the wall and said, these people are enemies of the state. So the whole city descended into chaos. Sulla basically took charge. He started murdering all of his enemies. He told people, basically turn in on each other. Like if you see somebody that has been listed on this wall, if you see somebody that goes by one of these names, then you can take their property, you can attack them. So it essentially created like a civil war. It was very looked down upon as like an authoritarian tyrant type person. So this is Marius. Marius had a long track record. Marius's mules, he was basically credited with transforming the Roman military and the legions. This was Caesar's uncle. So when Caesar was in his youth, he essentially was in a dangerous position of a lot of political turmoil in the Roman Republic. And he basically, the Romans were centered around war. They conquered everybody around them in Italy, Sicily, etc., and then moved into the European continent, down into Africa, Middle East, and other places. So Marius was responsible for a lot of that. So here you see Pompey and Sulla. Pompey is somebody who comes into the story prominently later on. He was a very powerful, influential man at the time as well. This is the movie of Julius Caesar, and what happened was basically he says, I see 10 Mariuses in this man. So Caesar was actually caught by Sulla, but Sulla gave him, basically let him escape because supposedly Pompey stuck up for Caesar and said that he didn't want him to die. So Sulla told him to kill Caesar anyways, and Caesar ends up fleeing so as not to be killed for his political affiliation. So that's kind of where he got his start. Big dreams, but a lot of problems. So here he is. As soon as he flees, he actually gets apprehended by a group of Sicilian pirates. So back then, obviously, there was a lot of different pirates that were out in the waters and people, opportunists, and so on. And interesting to note that these Sicilian pirates look very Arabic, very ethnic looking. I've always told people Sicilians are kind of a mixed bag. So he demands a higher ransom. They say, we want to get 20 talents for you. He says, you're going to get 100 for me at least. So that kind of shows you his level of self-pride, that he felt like they were demanding too low of a ransom. The story has it he fought for his safety, earned himself an extra day. As soon as they rescued him, he went back and killed all the pirates. So I think it should be noted too, this is Cornelia. This was one of Caesar's first wife, and one of his first loves, so he was deeply in love with Cornelia. If you can remember back a few minutes ago, Sulla basically cast Caesar out of Rome for a while. He was on the run. So before he was on the run, he had the priesthood, but he also was, basically Sulla said he had to divorce Cornelia, and Caesar chose to say no, even if his life was on the line, rather than divorce his wife. So the fact that he had been stripped of the priesthood meant that he could kind of get on a horse's back and get more involved in military stuff. So when he fled, he took part in different military campaigns. He stayed in a royal court for a while with a king, and his opponents accused him of being gay. I don't know if that was the case. But here's Caesar, he's delivering orations. So he was a great speaker. And he delivered a lot of different, he basically revealed a lot of governors for being corrupt and did a lot of work basically inspiring the people. So then he's on another military campaign. Sulla is now gone, so this is like when Caesar's age 30. He encounters this statue of Alexander the Great. He basically has an epiphany which says, wow, by the time Alexander the Great was 30, he had conquered the whole world. And he's basically showing his own ambition to himself, staring at this image of Alexander the Great. You know, Alexander the Great came 200 years before Caesar, and Caesar is saying, this is one epic historical figure looking at another saying, I need to catch up to you. So that's a picture of his own ambition. When he arrives back, he's basically climbing the ladder, and he's holds a number of different positions, and one of them is to be the head of games. So he was putting on these amazing events and festivals and gladiatorial matches, lions killing dudes, and 50 guys fighting anything for people's entertainment. And so that was something that really held Caesar's attention for a while. But at this point, he held the position of governor of Hispania and other such. So what we've got right here is a man by the name of Crassus. So Crassus was an upstart. Well, I don't know if you'd call it an upstart. He was an extremely successful businessman of the time. To put it in perspective, he'd be kind of like the Jeff Bezos of ancient Rome. He had a modern equivalent of over $1 billion. So he was a super wealthy businessman who essentially snowballed this wealth by investing in things like real estate and then continuing to build and build and build. Around the year 60 BC, this is 40 years into Caesar's life, so he's been climbing the ladder. He's now allied with Crassus. He had all these things happen, which we've stated already. He's extremely motivated, and he's dealing with these different groups. So you've got Pompey here. Pompey was born somewhere around the same time as Julius Caesar. And he was extremely powerful military general of the time. So what you have here is kind of a three-way agreement, not necessarily to further their ideals, but to further each other's personal interests. Pompey was born in 106 BC. He was a leading Roman general, statesman. Career was significant in Rome's transformation from a republic to an empire. So Pompey and Caesar had their own friendship. Let's see here. So Pompey's father was named Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, and he was the first of the gens Pompeia to achieve a senatorial status in Rome. Pompey went on to support the optimates, who were a pro-aristocracy faction. So the aristocracy was like the power structure. So they were more on the right wing, kind of more the elitists, whereas Marius was belonging to the popularis faction. So Pompey was part of this whole alliance with Caesar, which would eventually end up crumbling. So one of the things that leaders would do in this time period was they would, not just leaders, anyone would marry members of their family to each other. So this is Julius Caesar's daughter, Julia, his beloved daughter. He marries her to Pompey. So they had this alliance also based on that marriage. So, right, as I was saying, Pompey, he was allied with Sulla. So Sulla sent him a number of missions. He took place in a number of things. He was extremely powerful, took place in the Mithridatic War, etc. So Caesar had this allyship with Pompey. So once Sulla was gone, Pompey essentially was one of the powerful figures. So Caesar says, I need legions. He essentially trades his daughter for the legions. And so he sets his sights on Gaul. So Gaul is like, look at this patch. I don't know if it's necessarily all of that, but it's a huge swath of modern day Europe. And Caesar wanted to conquer all of it, so he was extremely ambitious at this point. He's making big moves. The Gauls were a collection of Celtic tribes, a massive part of Western Europe. Gallic warriors were legendarily known as being intimidating. Many of them were several feet taller than the Romans. They had long hair. The Romans kept short hair. They bared their chests. They had tattoos. They were known as barbarians by the Romans. They had, heads, spiked heads in their yards and all these other legends and such. So the Gauls were something that Caesar was setting his sights on. So he essentially sets out on this war with his triumvirate. But while he's gone, there's a lot of political wheeling and dealing going on in Rome. A lot of Caesar's enemies are threatened by his popularis faction, the fact that he's a popular leader, threatening the aristocracy. So this is a famous statue called the Wounded Gaul, made in 200 BC. So this is before Caesar, but shows the history of the Romans kind of defeating the Gauls and such, and it's more looked at empathetically now, but this was more them kind of flexing their muscles over the Gauls. So Caesar goes into Gaul, and so I think what needs to be noted about this time period is that waging a military campaign of this size is a massive undertaking. Just to feed your soldiers alone, you need a supply chain miles and miles long. You're marching with 60, 80, 100 pounds of gear on your back. You're sleeping in tents. You're fighting these brutal battles without any modern medicine for all of the casualties, all of the infections, all of the problems. I mean, it just needs to be noted how massive an undertaking it was for Caesar to go from tribe to tribe, to go through all of this land and all this territory. He really undertook one of the largest military projects in world history here to conquer something as large as Gaul at the time. So he really had high ambitions for this. So when we look at the Gallic Wars, it's a very ambiguous period in history because Caesar is known as a great leader, had a lot of positive qualities, but we can't overlook the fact that he killed over 1 million civilians when he conquered Gaul. He essentially went from tribe to tribe, conquering one after the other. And when you look at these battles specifically, go look up Caesar's conquering of Gaul. You see just a lot of miraculous military victories where he's outnumbered and he essentially beats the odds. And it all culminates with this Battle of Alesia. So let's take a look at it. So here we have Alesia. So the whole campaign in Gaul, Caesar just undertakes this brutal campaign. A lot of times the people are starving, they can't eat. They conquer all this territory, and they finally get to this city called Alesia. Alesia builds a fortification, and the Romans come and they can't conquer the fortification, so they build their own fortification. So they spontaneously build this wall around Alesia, and then the Gauls have an army, basically 300,000 strong, that's coming to counterattack the Romans. The Romans are sitting at the gates. There's another army coming at them from behind. So they build this wall to hold off the other army, and they're able to stem the attack of the other army and eventually keep a wall around Alesia and starve out their opponents. So that's how they end up winning that battle and eventually this entire war. So that's what Caesar did in Gaul. He conquered them, he slaughtered so many people, and then eventually he defeated all these armies. He's outnumbered. He has another army coming at him. He builds this fortification, holds them out, starves the people inside, and conquers the city. And at this point, the Gauls are exhausted because they basically threw everything they had into winning this battle, because they've already been losing territory steadily at that point. So Caesar is triumphant in Gaul at this point, and there's a leader, his name is Vercingetorix, who's a famous Celt who's basically opposing Caesar, and they capture Vercingetorix, and they succeed. But as we're about to see, a story does not end here. So now Caesar has more problems staring down than ever. So Caesar has emerged victorious in Gaul. But here we have Cato. So Cato represents the very conservative aristocracy of the Senate. They harshly oppose Caesar because they believe strongly that Caesar is threatening their power. Caesar is a popular ruler among the masses, and these people were known for oppressing the masses, so they weren't very fond of Caesar. While Caesar was in Gaul, Cato and others, Cassius, Longinus, Brutus, even Cicero, a lot of them essentially convinced Pompey to turn against Caesar. Also, Pompey's wife is Julia, Caesar's daughter. She dies. So basically Crassus dies as well. So now the triumvirate's gone. You have a direct conflict between the optimates and the populares, led by Caesar and led by Pompey. So Caesar's basically given an ultimatum: lay down all your arms, come back, face whatever. They were mad at Caesar, and they wanted to fuck him over, essentially. They were jealous of the power he had come up with and how powerful he was becoming. So they were basically saying, we're going to put you on trial. They were not very friendly to Caesar, even though he just conquered Gaul for Rome. So Caesar looks to his legions, his massive army, and he says, what do you think we should do? They say, fuck those guys, man. We don't care what they have to say. They're bitter. They're jealous. You're our leader, Caesar. We're going to follow you. So they march upon Rome. And upon marching upon Rome, Pompey and his allies, Cato and the others, all the people in the Senate who are jealous of Caesar at this point, they flee. Remember, Pompey let Caesar go, so this is all like stories coming full circle. Friends for years becoming enemies. It's very interesting how Pompey helped Caesar survive Sulla, but now they're coming head to head. So Caesar marches upon Rome and these guys flee. So basically what happens is a series of military engagements taking place in Illyria, Greece, Egypt, Africa, Hispania, and etc. So, long story short, Caesar defeats Pompey in almost every single battle they have, until finally at the Battle of Pharsalus, he defeats Pompey and his allies, and Pompey flees. So certain ones of them keep fighting, but a lot of them surrender, such as Cicero, Brutus, and others. Pompey flees to Egypt. So Pompey arrives in Egypt, and there's some people there. The people ruling Egypt at the time are called the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies were descended from a guy named Ptolemy who was friends with Alexander the Great. So hundreds of years before that, Alexander the Great had conquered the world, including Egypt. So now the people ruling Egypt were descended from Alexander the Great's friend Ptolemy. So one of these people was named Cleopatra. She's a very famous young woman who ruled Egypt. So when Pompey gets there, Cleopatra's brother, who is a puppet king, he's essentially a 12-year-old boy who's being he's technically the king, but he's 12, so there's another guy named Posthumus who's manipulating him and calling the shots. So Posthumus comes up with the idea to kill Pompey. So Pompey arrives, and Posthumus, in hoping to please Caesar, kills Pompey by snake bite or whatever. Gets his guards to stab him or something. So the legendary Pompey the Great is killed by basically a 12-year-old boy, but really his advisors. But power is being split between Cleopatra and her young brother Ptolemy at this point. Ptolemies have a fascinating history of all sorts of stuff, just crazy, crazy stuff. So Pompey dies at the hands of these guys, and Caesar goes to check out what exactly happened. So Caesar arrives in Egypt, and he sees this whole situation with the Ptolemies ruling Egypt, and Egypt was very important to Rome. It was known as the breadbasket of Rome. It was also known as a very highly respected place due to all of the magnificent, rich culture, Egyptian history and culture. So Caesar gets there and he's devastated. First of all, he's devastated that Pompey is dead. He's extremely upset. And he finds out that there's these people essentially controlling the boy Ptolemy, who's only 12. At this time, he meets the sister. Cleopatra sneaks herself into Caesar's quarters. And in the movie, she gives him this eloquent speech about Rome is day, Egypt is night, Rome is masculine, Egypt is feminine, etc. She seduces Caesar and basically tells him, together we can help rule the world together. So he has a hard time turning her down, since she essentially has a claim to the throne of Egypt. So he has sex with Cleopatra, and he impregnates her, and they sail back to Rome. Now when he gets to Rome, he's in a very interesting situation. He's got all these enemies, all these people, and he chooses to pardon them. He has Cleopatra, this new mistress. His wife is very jealous, and he says, "Look, I'm gonna pardon my enemies." Like his famous quote, "Sulla killed his enemies, I forgive mine." So he takes the mercy route, which, you know, it's very admirable, I guess, to see all these different sides of Caesar. He could kill 1 million people in Gaul, but he's going to forgive these people who are plotting against him. And I'll never really understand that part of the story, is why he didn't use more force against his enemies, really, in this case. So he arrives back, and there's this plot, you know, to assassinate Caesar. So this is when it starts, when he arrives back with Cleopatra, and they don't like that he has this foreign woman and a foreign ruler on his side. So interesting question to ask oneself. What would you do if you were in Caesar's shoes, right? Would you return to Rome, and you had all these people plot against you, but you're trying to consolidate, you're trying to unify your people and be a leader. What would you do if you had all these people plotting against you? You forgive them even though they opposed you, or do you annihilate them? You know, he was at a very serious turning point. He had more power than he ever had before. Pompey's now gone, even though he didn't want him to die. He just conquered Gaul. He just conquered a lot of his opponents, and he's now chosen to forgive them. And it's just interesting to ask yourself, what would you do if you were there at that time? So this is Tarquin, one of the Tarquins. So when Rome first was originated, they had 7 kings. The amount of tyranny and the amount of authoritarian control from these kings basically led Rome into a time period where they had a republic. The republic is actually just about to fall after this whole story. So they're going to go back to an empire with emperors, so they can almost go back to kings. So it's interesting because these people who are plotting against Rome and Caesar, against Caesar and Rome at this point, are doing so because they claim that they're against kings. They believe Caesar wants to be a king, and they don't want any kings. So they feel extremely threatened by Caesar. But the interesting part is that what happens in the eventual assassination of Caesar actually sends Rome back towards an era where they have kings again. But that was the fear, and that was the hate-mongering that was happening, is that at this point Caesar has become so powerful. He's conquered Gaul. He's held all these different positions. His army thinks he's a god. So at this point, he's become like the supreme ruler of Rome, and there's a lot of people who are very jealous of that. And so, you know, they plan to assassinate him. So this elaborate plot gets put together so that he will not become another king, supposedly. They're also very alarmed by the whole Cleopatra thing and him and her being a ruler of Egypt and them having a child together. So they hatched this plan. And one of the main conspirators is Brutus, who was a friend of Caesar's as a kid, and his mom was Caesar's mistress. So Caesar actually could have been Brutus's father as well. So here's Brutus. As I said, Caesar may or may not have been his father, but important to note, one of Brutus's ancestors was one of the original people who led the uprising against the kings. So he has it in his bloodline kind of to, you know, uphold this tradition in his family of destroying tyrants, destroying autocrats, destroying kings, establishing the control of the people, quote unquote, even though the Senate dominated the people as well. So Brutus and his half-brother Cassius convinces him finally. Brutus tells him, look, I have to know that Caesar wants to be king before I'll kill him, because he's essentially and literally stabbing Caesar in the back. So Cassius convinces him over a number of things. They say, beware of the Ides of March. People are putting crowns on top of Caesar's statue, and he's there with Cleopatra, and there's just all these different ominous omens. So then, this is Cassius, so Cassius helps convince Brutus that they're going to kill him. So there's actually a lot of co-conspirators. There's a lot of senators who plan on taking part in this assassination. So the day it's going to they have many plans they go over, and they decide on one. It's a painstaking process. They know they're putting it all on the line. If they fail, they'll die. This is Calpurnia, Caesar's wife. She has a dream. The day before it happens, the night before it occurs, she has a dream that Caesar's killed. Literally the night before, and she says, Caesar, I'm dreaming, and I see you're in a pool of your own blood in this bed. And she goes, I see blood everywhere in my dream. And she goes, please don't go to the Senate today. Just stay home or whatever. And she pleads with Caesar. She has such a strong omen it's amazing, from the night before, that she tries to convince Caesar to stay home, and he says, I can't. He also dined with some of his assassins days before that, and they asked him late in the night, they were asking, how would you like to die? And he, not that, you know, just philosophically or, you know, hypothetically, he says suddenly, without expecting it. So that day at the Senate, she tries to convince him not to go, but they convince him to show up. He goes on the Senate floor, and they have daggers concealed in their cloaks, and they approach him for a matter of business, and then boom, one guy stabs him, and the next guy stabs him, and the next guy stabs him, and they all stabbed the shit out of Caesar and killed him on the Senate floor. So that was how his life ended. He just died in a pool of his own blood. And Calpurnia tried to warn him, and I don't know how she knew that it was coming, but she tried to warn him, and that was how he was killed. So, legendary life and everything, and ultimately killed by his enemies who he had pardoned. Upon seeing Caesar in a pool of his own blood, Mark Antony, Caesar's general, took up his cause and basically pursued his co-conspirators, and a lot of them ended up being killed or committing suicide. And their goal was to end the kings, but what ended up happening was the next person to take up power after Caesar was a guy named Octavian, who was Caesar's heir and his nephew, or heir to his, his will, his estate. He didn't have a throne because he wasn't a king. But Octavian ends up defeating Mark Antony, who teams up with Cleopatra. Since Cleopatra's lover, Julius Caesar, has died, she goes for his second in command. Octavian takes over, and it actually becomes an empire. So at this point, what they wanted was no kings, but the person who comes after Julius Caesar is Augustus Caesar. And Augustus Caesar is the first emperor of Rome. So this is called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and it starts with Augustus Octavian Caesar. And so that's a whole story unto itself, but that's how he died, and that's how he lived. So takeaways from Caesar's life include the Julian calendar, which up until the Gregorian calendar, which just made slight adjustments to the Julian calendar, his Julian calendar is essentially the same exact calendar that we use today. So he remade the calendar. The Romans spoke Latin, which helped form the English language. So the language we're speaking comes from Rome. Their political system, their military organization, their aqueducts, architecture, you name it, almost everything the Romans did had a massive impact on the modern world. For instance, the conquering of Gaul we talked about. That combined two massive parts of Europe in one empire, exchanged culture, genetics, everything between different groups. So you got the Julian calendar, you got Latin, you got the Senate, you got military tactics, military organization, you name it, you can keep going down the line. The Romans' food, culture, the gods, the myths had a massive impact on the modern world. So Julius Caesar was one of the most influential and intriguing leaders of this time period, and as a result of Julius Caesar's life, the Republic ended up crumbling in the resulting civil wars between Antony and the conspirators, and what emerged was the Roman Empire with Augustus Caesar. So maybe next time I'll do an episode on Augustus Caesar. But to anyone who made it this far or ended up watching this, I just want to say thank you, and shoot for the stars, and always show ambition just like Julius Caesar did, because I believe that it's the ones who really put themselves out there and pursue their dreams that will be known by history. So whether he was a good or bad man, I don't know, but I know that he was great. Thank you guys very much. I love you.